Hi, this is podcast number 5. This is going to be a short podcast and it's dealing with a subtopic that's not covered in articles. And this one is on human health risks from hormonal growth promotants in cattle. Just before we get started, another article that's just been recently published on the Substack Environmental Health Effects is one about the subject of the toxic brevetoxin situation in the ocean down in South Australia. If you've watched the Four Corners report on Monday the 16th on ABC TV, it had a really good coverage of that. The only problem with the coverage was that they didn't look at what caused it. And it just repeats over and over this situation. So my article that I did some research on as to the causes or possible causes, it is a hypothesis after all, but it seems to be very strongly correlated with the happenings of the algal growth, algal blooms in the oceans. And those algal blooms have actually decimated the fish population and caused a lot of health problems with people that are living near the coast because the brevetoxin can be aerosolized from the waves and surf and travel inland for quite a distance. Even the kangaroos on nearby land were affected and hundreds had to be put down, and that was covered by the Four Corners report. And this situation is likely to occur in other parts of the world and indeed Australia. And it'd be nice if they actually did some investigation on the areas that I outline in my article. Anyhow, that's there. For the time being, though, tonight on the podcast, let's deal with our main subject, the hormonal growth promotants. The use of hormonal growth promotants, HGPs, in cattle production has created a sharp regulatory divide between nations with significant implications for international trade and public health. While Australia, the United States, Canada, and several other countries permit these substances, the European Union has maintained a complete ban since 1988. Making things even more complicated, both HGPs and antibiotics are regularly administered in feedlot systems, not just for health reasons, but as essential components of intensive production. A comprehensive review of the scientific literature shows concerning evidence about individual hormones and antibiotics, but even more worryingly, a notable lack of research on the combined effects that mirror actual consumer exposure. In the United States, HGP use is widespread. The most popular product is Revelor, a mix of estradiol benzoate and trenbolone acetate, used in about 72% of all feedlot cattle. 7 hormone drugs are approved by the FDA: testosterone, propionate, and trenbolone acetate, estradiol, zeranol, progesterone, melangestrol acetate, and bovine somatotropin. Australia maintains a more regulated middle ground. About 6.1 million HGP doses are sold each year, making up roughly 50% of the national beef kill, with most happening in feedlots. The Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, the APVMA, oversees distribution, requiring purchaser declarations, detailed record keeping, and visible identification of treated cattle through triangular ear punch marks. Australian producers must separate HGP treated cattle to ensure access to markets like the EU, China, and domestic retailers such as Coles, which reject treated beef. The European Union banned zeranol and similar growth promoters in 1985, extended the ban to all HGPs by 1988, and prohibited imports of treated beef in 1989. This ban remains in place despite World Trade Organization rulings that it lacks scientific justification, leading to ongoing trade disputes, especially with the US, which have cost the US producers an estimated $1 billion in lost European market access. Importantly, HGPs operate within a demanding feedlot system that it itself needs pharmaceutical intervention. The feedlot setup causes extreme stress through weaning, transport, mixing thousands of animals from different sources, sudden diet shifts from grass to high-grain feeds, and crowded confinement. These stresses weaken immune function, increasing the likelihood of disease outbreaks. Upon feedlot entry, US cattle typically receive 28 to 65 days of prophylactic tetracycline and sulfamethazine to prevent disease during the initial stressful period, along with ionophores and tyrosine throughout the finishing phase. A 2017 USDA survey found that 56% of US feedlots used medically important antimicrobials in feed for prevention, control, or treatment of respiratory disease, coccidiosis prevention, and growth promotion. The NCBI openly states cattle can be successfully raised and disease controlled through range-type rearing. However, this system would lead to a reduction in total beef production by about 50%, as feedlot production would be lost. In other words, intensive feedlot systems are naturally prone to disease and rely on antibiotics and growth promoters to operate. Importantly, disease prevention and growth promotion are often closely linked. Antibiotics that prevent liver abscesses caused by high-grain feedlot diets also promote growth because healthier animals gain weight more quickly. Similarly, HGPs that improve feed efficiency decrease the time cattle spend in the disease-prone conditions of feedlots. Research has demonstrated that zeranol stimulates human breast cancer cell proliferation at concentrations similar to those encountered in dietary exposure. It was found that zeranol transformed normal human breast epithelial cells into cells showing early signs of cancer development, with treated cells increasing by volume by 5-fold. It was observed that there were correlations between early breast development in young girls and detectable zearalenone metabolites in the food supply. Zeranol acts as an estrogen receptor agonist with about 1,000 times the estrogenic potency of natural estrogens. Although banned in Europe since 1985, zeranol remains widely used in the US and Australia under the brand Ralgo. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies estradiol 17-beta as a Group 1 human carcinogen, the same category as tobacco. Prospective epidemiological studies consistently associate elevated circulating estradiol with a higher risk of breast cancer in postmenopausal women. The European Food Safety Authority expressed concern that estradiol 17-beta has genotoxic potential and that misplaced or multiple implants could result in considerable risk that highly contaminated meat could enter the food chain. However, US and Australian regulators emphasise that hormone levels of treated beef remain well below those in eggs and milk, and approximately 95% of oral estradiol is inactivated during first-pass metabolism. Indonesian research examining imported beef, mainly from Australia and US, and trenbolone residues in nearly 100% of samples, though below codex limits. Researchers warn that regular consumption might contribute to cervical, breast, and prostate cancers, although causation remains unresearched. The Food Safety Commission of Japan identified increased mammary gland tumours in mice given MGA at 1.5 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day, with significant adverse effects including memory hyperplasia and raised prolactin levels. Japan set a cautious acceptable daily intake of 0.02 micrograms per kilogram body weight per day based on primate research. The most significant gap relates to combination effects, specifically how these substances are actually used. There are no published human epidemiological studies examining health effects of hormone combinations, nor studies examining the combined effects of hormones plus antibiotics consumed simultaneously. This gap is particularly concerning because hormones can act synergistically rather than additively. In the US, it has been found that the potential for human exposure to residues of these compounds, as well as the risks that may result from this exposure, is poorly understood. Current safety assessments in both the US and Australia evaluate each compound individually rather than as combinations actually administered or ingested. No research investigates effect on children, pregnant women, individuals with hormone-sensitive conditions during critical development periods. Subtherapeutic antibiotic feeding encourages antimicrobial resistance. It's been documented that clear pathways for resistant bacteria transmission from livestock to humans is via the food chain. An estimated 73% of global antimicrobials are used for farm animals, with agricultural use expected to rise 67% from 2010 to 2030. Denmark's experience offers hope. After banning growth-promoting antimicrobials in cattle and pigs, production levels were maintained while substantially reducing antibiotic use, demonstrating that intensive production is achievable without routine pharmaceutical intervention, though it requires different management strategies. The United States, the FDA, concluded residues pose no significant risk when used according to good veterinary practice. In Australia, the APVMA and MLA concluded that no increase in risk of adverse health risks through acknowledged estradiol 17 beta is potentially carcinogenic. European Union applied the precautionary principle, expressing concern that any increase in hormones exposure may contribute to cancer risk. The WHO decided that residues from proper use pose no appreciable risk. So what's actually tested? In the United States, no routine surveillance testing for HGP residues in domestic beef. The NRP focuses overwhelmingly on antibiotics, not hormones. Hormones are FDA approved, so testing focuses on ensuring products meet label claims, for example, raised without hormones, rather than safety. Australia, HGP testing primarily for export compliance, that is, to the EU and China markets. The domestic beef for Australian consumption appears to have no routine HGP residue monitoring. Random NRS testing may include some hormone screening, but this is not emphasised in published reports. Testing for violations, not presence. Both system tests whether residues exceed legal limits, not whether residues are present at all. Since HGPs and antibiotics are legal, their presence is expected and permitted. Neither system tests for multiple hormone residues simultaneously, hormone plus antibiotic combinations, synergistic or additive effects, total lifetime exposure assessments. Even tens of thousands of samples represent a tiny fraction of total production. US slaughters about 35 million cattle annually. Even 50,000 samples is 0.14% of production. Australia slaughters about 8 million cattle annually. 30,000 property audits over 14 years, which is about 2,150 per year. Metabolites. Many HGPs form active metabolites in cattle that may have different properties than their parent compounds. These are often not specifically tested. Testing focuses on acute violations, not cumulative low-level exposure over lifetime consumption. Vulnerable populations, no special testing protocols for meat destined for children, pregnant women, or other vulnerable groups. Both countries have sophisticated residue monitoring for antibiotics with high sensitivity, parts per billion detection. However, hormone residue testing is minimal in domestic beef programs, focused mainly on export compliance. Both systems test for violations of legal limits, not presence or absence. Since HGPs are legal and approved, residues are expected and permitted. No testing for combined effects or cumulative exposure. Sample sizes represent tiny fractions of total production. The 100% compliance or less than 1% violation statistics are misleading. They confirm the system works as designed, residues within the legal limits, not that the meat is residue-free. The fundamental issue, regulatory monitoring confirms products meet approved standards, but doesn't address whether those approval standards adequately protect public health, particularly for long-term, low-level exposure to multiple compounds simultaneously. Again and again, this occurs. Okay, so all up, I wish the Meat and Livestock Association and the other authorities in Australia would actually be concerned about their consumers, not just meeting residue limits that other countries set for protecting their people from residues. Anyhow, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next podcast. Bye. The information in this podcast is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Information on this podcast must be discussed with your healthcare provider. Don Want disclaims any responsibility for any adverse effect from the use of the podcast information. Guest opinions are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for the statements made by guests.